What's up guys, Vylocity here, back with another Unreal Engine 5 material tutorial, and in today's video, we'll be learning how to create an advanced post-process cell shader material that works and applies to your entire scene, and then if you want to exclude something from it, you can go ahead and do that if you please. Now, it's a little bit different from my last cell shader material, which was sort of an object-based material that you had to apply to each individual thing that you want. This aims to fix that problem and apply to everything by default, and it also works fully with metallic surfaces, reflections, ambient occlusion, and even with colored point lights, as well as an outline material, which I'll be showing how to create at the end as a bonus. Just before we hop into the tutorial, if you guys like what we do here at Pitchfork, the number one way to support us is by checking out our new game, Skyblocker, which we just released on Steam for only 10 bucks. It's a fun and relaxing 3D puzzle game where you stack blocks infinitely high until the physics or wind knocks it over. It's complete with awesome unlockable block skins, multiple levels, and a global online leaderboard to compete with your friends or others around the world. We hope you enjoyed as much as we enjoyed making it. Now let's get into the tutorial. If you're adding this material to an existing project, you can skip this step entirely. However, if you're following along from scratch, go ahead and create a third-person character template in the Games category, and I'm in Unreal Engine version 5.5. However, this will work in any version of the engine, so don't worry too much about that. And then name the project whatever you like and click Create. The first thing I want to do in the engine is to create a folder for materials, so I'll right-click, New Folder, name it Materials, and then inside here, I'll create two more folders. One for post process and one for characters. You might want to set yours up differently, but I'll just call it characters and we'll create some materials for the mannequin. And now we can go inside post process, right click and make a new material. I'll call it PP for post process underscore cell. Click enter and we can go ahead and open this up. The first thing that we want to do is change the material domain from surface to post-process. The preview should go dark, and we should only have an emissive color output for the root node. And then we want to scroll down to find blendable location and change it from scene color after tone mapping to scene color before DOF. And if you don't see this option, it means you're probably on an earlier version of the engine. I think version 5.3 and before, it only has before tone mapping, and you want to select that one. So if you see before tone mapping, select that. If you see scene color before DOF, select that, and it should work the same. The first thing that we want to do is right click and search for scene texture. This allows us to get different aspects of our scene to use in the material to affect them in different ways. And what we want to get here is the base color for lighting. And just to showcase what that does, if I plug it into emissive color, it just makes it so it looks unlit and it's just the color information for our scene. Now I'll save just to show one error that you might run into, and it is this warning compilation errors in this material. It's only for DirectX mobile at quality level high. This is a very specific error, and in most cases, you're good to bypass this. Now, if you are working with mobile device games in this quality level, you might want to look into this a little bit more. It goes beyond the scope of this tutorial, so what I'll do is just click Don't Show This Again and continue. Now we can go back to our third-person map, and I just want to showcase sort of what this post-process material does. And if I just find my post-process volume, again, if you don't have one of these in your scene, you can just click this little box with the plus button, go to volumes, add a post-process volume, and then make sure that you have extent unbound checked to be on, so it goes across the whole scene. And then what we can do is first right click on our material here, create a material instance. I'll just keep it the same name since we'll probably only have one of them. And then in our post process volume, we want to search for materials and hit this drop down for post process materials, add an array element, choose from asset reference, and then we'll just drag in our new material instance. And you'll notice that the whole scene looks very flat and the sky is dark, and that's because we're just seeing the base color lighting information from all the materials. And if I go ahead and just set this value to 0, so we go back to the default and switch our lit mode from lit to unlit, you can notice that it's the same thing. So basically what we're doing here is we're recreating the lighting from our scene inside of the post-process material, and we're going to customize it so we get the different bands, and we can do all sorts of different things to sort of create a really nice cell shading look. So we can go back to our material now and continue working in here. Next, what we want to do is to unhook the color from here, and we'll actually just drag off of here, search for reroute declaration node, and we'll name this the base color. And then from here, we can copy this red node twice. And we'll change this first one from base color to post process input 0. And this actually is just our scene. So if I've plugged this in and hit save and go back to our map, you can see that there's no change. And I do have the post process material on. So if I change it off and then back on, you should see no change at all. And that's good. That's what we need. And then back in here, we can unhook this from the color. And we can right click and search for a component mask. We just need to get the R channel for the first one. And then we'll paste this down below. We'll change this to the G and do that again to get the B. So we have R, G, and B. Move this down a bit. Next, we can plug the color into all three of these like this. And we can right click and search for max. And we'll copy this twice. And the R will go into the top of the first one, and then the G and the B will go into these two, and then this bottom max goes into the top of the B here. And this basically is going to desaturate the color from this scene, and it will make it look a little bit nicer than simply using the desaturation node. It keeps the color values a little bit more accurate. And what we can do is copy and paste this down here. We'll do the same for this. Plug these up like that. And then we can drag this all back a bit. And then we can right click and search for divide. And we'll divide the top one by this one. And then if we plug this in here, we can, well, first we need to just be safe. We'll saturate this, keeps the values between 0 and 1. And right away you can see it's basically just the default lighting in the scene. So again, we want to make sure we check do not show this again and continue. If you are working with a mobile game, you might want to look into this a little bit more, but for most cases, this is fine to bypass. So I'll check this and click continue. And then in here, we can see that we just get the default lighting and we get the nice shadows and things. So we'll use this to further the cell shading effect and use it as the base. From here, we can unhook this and I'll drag off and search for reroute declaration again. And I'll just name this lighting. And then we can highlight everything here and click C. And we'll call this base color and lighting. If I could type right, there we go. And I'm actually going to drag this quite a bit back because we're going to need some space. And now we're good to start creating the bands of the cell shading. So we can right click and search for our base color. And this is just that reroute node that we made up here. So we're basically getting this, so we don't have to copy and paste that node all over the place. And then we can hold M for a multiply and click. And we'll multiply the base color by a parameter called light A. I'm going to use the alphabet to do this. You could use numbers. You could name them like light dark, light darker, light bright. But just for simplicity, I'll use A, B, C, and D. And of course, you can create as many bands that you want or limit the amount of bands. You might only want one band or 2 bands, but I think I'll be creating about 4. From here, we can set the default value of this. And it's going to seem like a weird number, but bear with me. It's going to be 0.03125. And the reason that I'm using this is because if you multiply this, for example, by 4, or again by 4 again, it's 0.5. So it's basically it's a division thing. That way it stays in line with the rest of the numbers. If I divide this again by there we go. So 0.03125, and this is going to be the darkest band. From here, we can copy this, and I'm going to rename light A to light B, and we'll do 0.125. So this will be about, I think 4 times brighter. Yeah. Then we can hold L and click for a lerp node. This will blend between these two options here based on this alpha. And the alpha will be based on our lighting that we created, that black and white shadow effect that we have in our scene now. Oh, whoops. So now we can begin creating the alpha that we'll use to separate the different bands. And to do that, we'll right click and search for our lighting. This is again the reroute node that we created up here. And then from here, we can get a subtract node. And we'll plug this into the A. And the B will be a scalar parameter. So I'll hold S and click, and I'll call this band A. Plug this into here. By default, this will be 0.25. And then we want to then multiply by sort of a contrast value. This will tighten up the band. So if you want the bands to not be a solid, sharp line, you could have them be a little bit softer if you want. And we'll do that by holding S for another scalar. And we'll call this shadow contrast. And I'll make the default value 500. This will make it very sharp. I'll plug that in like that. And I'll double click on this just to keep it organized because we'll have to use this a few more times. And then from here, we can drag off and search saturate, keeps the value between 0 and 1. And this becomes the alpha for that. Then I guess I could drag this down. So, and now we can actually, you can copy all of these. And we'll call this one band B. Default value will be 0.5. We're stepping up by 0.25. And then we will copy these 4. And the saturate is the alpha. And then this previous lerp becomes the A here. So basically we're blending between these two bands with another band of light. So then I can plug this in to here. Whoops. Then I'll double click to reroute that. And then we want to rename light B here to light C. And this value will be 0.5. So it's lighter than this one. And these, of course, are parameters, so they're meant to be adjusted to your liking. And then I'll copy this stuff down once more. Plug that in like that. This will be band C. And this number will be 0.75. Then I'll copy everything here. Except for this one, we actually don't need this multiply and this light C, because this band is going to be just the default lighting that is in our scene. We're just going to use the base color for this specific band. We don't want to affect the brightness of it. This is sort of the baseline band, and or sort of the middle band, I guess you could consider it. And then from here, we can copy these nodes once more, plug the shadow contrast into this reroute, grab one more lerp, and this will go into the A of this lerp. The saturate will go into the alpha, and then we just need the B input, which will be another version of this base color multiplied by parameter. And we'll call this light D. And then this right here will be 2. The reason it's 2 instead of a number below 1 is because this is actually going to be sort of the highlighting band that appears it's basically the brightest band. So we want it to be brighter than the base color by 2. Again, you can adjust this. And it looks like I accidentally, or no, I just forgot to name this one band D. We'll do this. And we want to make this default value 0.99. Cool. So we have band A, B, C, and D, and then light A, B, C, and D, and they're all increasing in values, and that's what we want. Now we can highlight all of these, click C, and we'll call this light bands, something like that. All right, so now we have basically the cell shading, but what we need now is to have a way to bring back the lighting from point lights or any sort of light that you add to your scene, for example, a spotlight, a rect light. And to do that, we can actually copy these nodes here, all of these masks and max nodes, so all of these. And we'll paste these down here. And then first we want to drag off of our last lerp here and plug it into all of these here. And then we can right click again, search for scene texture, and we'll switch this to the post-process input 0. And I'll right click and search for component mask. And we need to check RG and B. So this one has all 3 of the channels selected. And then from here, we can drag this into the R, G, and B. And I'll drag these down, and then I'll right click and search for divide. And we want to divide the post-process scene by this here. Next, we can hold M and click for a multiply. And this max will go into the A, and then this lower logic here will go into the B. And this gives us back our lighting from the post-process scene, which again is just our scene as we usually see it in all of the colors from the lights. And we're basically multiplying it on top of the cell shading. Without this, a point light, even if you set it to, for example, purple, the color in the scene won't update to that. It'll just be black and white. So this should help fix that. I'll click C and I'll call it add colored lights back into scene. From here, we can add a way to tint the lighter areas of our cell shading and the darker areas. For example, if you want to stylize your scene a little bit and have the shadows be more of a blue or a red or whatever it is that you'd like. So what I'll do is hold 3 for a color, right click, convert to parameter, and I'll call this tint highlight. And then I'll duplicate this tint shadow. And I'll set these both to be a default value of white so they don't affect anything, because anything multiplied by 1 or white will just be itself. And then I want to hold L and click for alert. And I actually have these in the wrong order. We want the shadow to be up top, and this will go into A. The highlight will go into B. And we need to right click and search for our lighting. This is again the black and white shadow information. And we want to drag off of this and search for a round. This rounds the values up or down basically, and it makes it so it's a harsh transition and not a soft gradient. From here, this will become our alpha. And then we can hold M and click for a multiply, and we just want to multiply everything else by this. And then we want to drag off of this and just get another component mask and make sure we check R, G, and B, all 3. You'll probably get an error if you don't do that. And we'll highlight all of that, click C, and we'll call this tint scene. And then from here, we can drag off and search for, actually we won't drag off, we'll just right click and search again for scene texture. And what we're going to do now is add back the ambient occlusion, which is the nice soft shadows that appear in the corners of your scene and little crevices and things. So we need to find ambient occlusion. Oh, it's down a little bit. And we will copy this mask RGB from the last part there and plug that into that. From here, we want to get a multiply. And this will go into the B. And we'll hold L for a lerp. And this will go into B as well. Now we need a parameter. We'll call this AO for ambient occlusion intensity. And default value can be 1. Plug that like that. And then this RGB goes into this lerp and the multiply. So if this value is 1, it will use all of the input from B. If it's 0, it will use all of the input from A. If it's a value of, for example, 0.5, it would use half and half, or 0.75, it would use more of the second input, which is the ambient occlusion. So in this case, we are going to fully multiply our scene, or the rest of our cell shading, by the ambient occlusion. And we'll visualize that after we add the material to our scene. We can highlight everything, click C, and call this ambient occlusion. Next, I want to add a way to exclude certain things from the cell shading. For example, you could exclude everything from the cell shading except your characters, or you could exclude the water in your scene or certain objects, for example, the grass or things like that. Now, obviously, depends on your art style. Maybe you want everything cell shaded except for something else. So what we can do is add a way to simply check on and off on certain objects in your scene to use the cell shading or not. To do that, we can search for a scene texture node, and I'll duplicate this 3 times. The top one needs to be scene depth, The next one needs to be custom depth. And then the last one will be the post-process input 0. We need to get a component mask, so I'll right click and search for that. The top one needs to just be R, and the second one also is just the R channel. Single channel information. And then we can duplicate this again, and this one needs to be R, G, and B. Now we need to get an if node, so you can right click and search for if. I also think if you hold I and click, it gives you an if statement, which is pretty handy. And R goes into A from the top scene depth. And then custom depth goes into B. And then this post process goes into A is greater than B. And then the cell shading goes into A less than B. So basically what this is saying is if custom depth is true, if it's on, then just use the post process input 0, which again is just the base scene without any cell shading. And if custom depth is disabled, which is going to be disabled by default, it will use all the cell shading. So by default, everything's going to be cell shaded. And if you want things to be not cell shaded, you'll have to go into the item or the object and click use custom depth. And I'll show that in a minute. But if you want it the other way around, where everything is not cell shaded by default, but you want to be able to select certain things to be cell shaded, for example, just your characters, you might want to switch these around. That way, by default, everything will be your regular post-process scene. And then when you click custom depth on the actor, it will switch to the cell shading. But I'm going to leave it like this. And then from here, I'll select everything, click C, and call this exclude from cell shading. Next, we need a way to exclude the sky from the cell shading. I'll just drag this over here. So we'll need another if node. And we'll also need these two. So I'll copy those over like this. And then we need a constant value. So I'll hold 1 and click, and I'll give this a value of 500,000. So basically really far from the camera, it won't give the cell shading. And this goes into B. And this A less than B goes into our previous logic here. Should be able to highlight all of this and click C. We'll call this exclude sky from cell shading. Whoops, cannot type today. Still can't type. Imagine that. All right, now we can plug this into here. And as you can see, we start to get some cell shading on this preview sphere. Some little weird artifacts here that will adjust when we get into the level. All right, once we get back into our level, you might see some strange things happening with the walls and the shadows of our level, and that's to be expected because we still have lumen turned on, most likely. So what we want to do is, first we want to go to our directional light and change intensity from 3 to 5. This just brightens everything up, and so we can see things a little bit better, and it makes the bands sort of function better. Now we can go into our post-process volume and scroll down until we find global illumination, and check this box on. And then here you can turn from lumen to none. And as you can see, it gets rid of most of the issues, but we still get some strange banding here. But as we rotate our light, you can see we can kind of mitigate that effect. You will notice sometimes you get this strange diagonal wavy line on the wall, and that's because the cell shading is trying to calculate the bands of your lighting on a flat surface, which is pretty hard to do for it. So we just need to rotate our light until we don't get that effect anymore. Looks like that's pretty good. And now we can go to our exponential height fog. And what I want to do is set the start distance from 0 to 50,000. It may not look like it does much of a difference now, but on a larger level, the exponential height fog can kind of combat the cell shading, and it can cause some visual artifacts. So by pushing this distance out or simply removing it altogether can reduce the effects there. And on that note, I will be creating a post-process fog material tutorial soon that goes really well with the cell shading. Whether or not you're using cell shading, it doesn't matter, but it does sort of complement it pretty nicely, and it works with the cell shading. So, but for now, I'll just set this to 50,000 just to sort of push out that distance. Next, I want to go into my skylight and I want to keep mine at movable. If you set it to stationary, you can get some weird issues here, and static doesn't look bad, but it does make the shadows completely dark. So I like to leave it on movable. And you can also experiment with changing the source type from the captured scene, which is just everything around you, to a cube map. And this allows you to, well, this might be none by default, but you can drop this down and select any of these default template cube maps here. So for example, we have this daylight one. And what this will do is it'll make it so your reflections fall back to this image if you have your reflections turned off, which can be super performant. So if you're going for a stylized game and you want it to be as performant as possible, you might consider using a cube map like this, or maybe even a desert one, or creating your own, and then going into your post-process volume and finding reflections and turning those off as well. So you would have both global illumination and reflections off, and then you would use the skylight specified cube map of your choice to get the reflection shapes that you want. What I'll do though is I'll leave this off in captured scene, and I'll go back to my post-process volume and make sure my reflections are on screen space just for a little bit more of a realistic reflection look. Next, we can go into our volumetric cloud, and the clouds that are in Unreal Engine 5.5 are updated to use a newer, more realistic shader, but it is quite expensive. So you might notice a little bit lower frames in the editor when working in Unreal Engine 5.5. And one way I found to help reduce that is changing the tracing max distance mode in the volumetric cloud from this distance from cloud layer entry point to distance from point of view. And you'll notice that it just removes the very far distant clouds that were touching the horizon, which honestly, I believe you don't really need anyway, because in most games you'll have some sort of background mountains or buildings that would cover up this area, and it won't look so empty in the distance, and it'll gain you a little bit more frames from having it on all the way. So I like to have it on point of view. If you guys do want to exclude an object from the cell shader effect, all you need to do is click on the object, and in the details panel, search for custom depth, and there should be this render custom depth pass. Just check that, and instantly you'll see that the cell shader effect is gone from this cube. This is useful for things like water or really any other object that you don't want to be cell shaded, or you think maybe looks better without the cell shading. You can just go ahead and enable custom depth pass here in the details panel. All right, next we can go ahead and drag out the character that we'll be using to test the cell shading on. And in my case, we'll just be using the mannequin. So I'll go into mannequins and then animations. I'll do Manny, and then I'll do the MM idle. Looks like this is Quinn, but that's okay. That'll do. And then I'll just go back to my content folder and materials. And as you can see, Quinn here is cell shaded. You can see that the lighting has some bands. However, there is some areas that don't look so great, and that's because the material that they use for Manny and Quinn is a bit advanced and has some complex things going on for the specularity and metallic effects. So what we'll do is create a new material for all of our characters and props in our game. So I'll go into characters that we created this folder, and then I'll right click new material, and I'll name this M underscore character. And the way that this material will work out is it could actually be your material for the props in your game as well. I'm just naming it character for the sake of the tutorial, but you'll kind of see where it's at the end, and you can make the decision if you should have more master materials or not. But for now, I'll just open up M character, and we'll go into here and make it full screen. The first thing we want to do is right click and search for texture sample parameter 2D, and we'll name this exclusion mask. And by default, we'll just set it to be a black texture. I'll select this black sRGB texture. And off of RGBA, it's important that we use all four of these. We want to drag off and search for channel mask parameter. And we'll call this exclusion channel. And the reason we're doing this is a parameter that on the material instance, we'll be able to select which one of these four channels that we want to use for our exclusion mask. And the exclusion mask will be to determine two different parts of the material on our mesh. For example, two different colors we could have on two different areas, or we could have, one area be shinier than the other. And this allows us to achieve that. And pretty much most characters that you may make should have a texture like this, or if you have a character from some marketplace pack or some third party asset that you're using, it should come with some sort of texture that you can use for this effect. And if not, it's pretty easy to make one in the free 3D modeling program Blender. But for now, you should be able to follow along, and by default, you'll be able to still work with this just fine. So off of exclusion mask, I want to search for reroute and just search for named reroute declaration node. And then from here, you can type in exclusion. And now we can right click and get another texture sample parameter. And we'll call this albedo. And by default, we'll make this one a white texture. Whoops. Just white sRGB is fine. There should be a ton of those in your project in the engine. And off of here, we want to search for multiply. And now we want to multiply by two different colors. So I'll hold 3 and click for a color, right click, convert to parameter, name this color. Default value should be white. That way, if our albedo texture does have color information, the white will just multiply it by 1, so therefore there won't be a change. Now we can duplicate this, and we'll call this one color B. And now we need to lerp between these two colors based on our exclusion mask that we created. So we can right click and search for exclusion. And then we can right click and search for linear interpolate, or you can hold L and click for a lerp. And this takes an A and B input, and our alpha will be the exclusion. And this is what we'll multiply our color texture by. So this goes into base color. So by default, everything should be white unless we put in a texture or a color to tint the texture. I'll just drag this up a little bit, get some more space. Now we can hold S and click for a scalar parameter. We'll call this one metallic. We're going to do the same thing that we did with the color. Default can be 0, and then I'll copy this down and name this metallic B. And we can copy this lerp and exclusion again, and we'll just do the same thing. So A will be our default parameter, and then if we do have an exclusion mask, which you don't have to use, by the way, you could just have a flat color with different values for metallic and roughness. And then we can also have our B in case you do want to have the exclusion mask. This just goes into metallic. I'll duplicate all of this, and this will be called roughness. And roughness B. Default values for these will be 0.5. We don't want it to be super shiny by default, so 0.5 is a nice middle ground. This goes into roughness. Notice we do skip specular for now, and we'll come back to this at the very end because I want to show the reason that we do want to set this to 0 later on. You can copy all this once more, and this will be called anisotropy, if I can spell. There we go. I'll copy that and paste it there. So we have anisotropy and anisotropy B. These default values should be 0. We don't want anisotropy on our character by default. This is only if we want to enhance the metallic effect on our characters that do have sort of a shiny look to it. We can stretch the reflections with this parameter. Next, we can do the emissive color. I'll right click, search for a texture sample parameter again. We'll call this emissive mask. By default, we can set this to be a white texture. So I'll search for white, and I'll try to find that same sRGB texture so we're not sampling too many different textures. It doesn't matter which white texture you use, but if you are using it more than once, for example, I'm using it up here, you do want to use the same texture just to save on some texture samples. From here, we can drag off RGBA again, and we can search for channel mask parameter. This will be called emissive channel. Similar to how we did the exclusion, just in case you have a packed texture with different things in the RGBA, this allows you to select per instance which one of those you want to use to mask out where the emissive bits are. From here, we can drag off and search for multiply. And we need another color, so I'll hold 3 and click, right click, convert to parameter, and I'll call this emissive tint. Default value should be black, which means it's off. And then from here, we can drag up to emissive and plug it in like that. Next, we can get one more texture sample parameter, and we'll call this normal. And by default, this should be a flat normal. You'll see different ones in here. Some are darker, some are lighter. They end up all being the same. You can just choose one of them. And then from RGB, we can plug this into normal. All right, so by default, as long as our exclusion mask is black, it should use all of the parameters that are plugged into A. So for example, if we don't have an exclusion mask, it will use color, metallic, roughness, anisotropy. But if we do have an exclusion mask with black and white information, where the texture is black, it will use the original color, metallic, and roughness. And where this texture has white in it, it will use the color B, metallic B, roughness B. And I'll showcase that here in just a bit. Now we can go ahead and save and go back to our map. All right, the first thing I want to do is create 2 simple material instances by right-clicking and create material instance. And I'll name this one mi underscore character underscore flat. Actually, instead of flat, I'll do plastic. And then I'll duplicate this one and I'll call it metallic. And that should be good for now. I just want to showcase some different examples. I'll duplicate the mannequin here a few times. And on this first one, I'll drag on the metallic. The second one, we'll do plastic. And actually, I will go ahead and do, I'll do a flat one as well. We'll do matte. Matte can go here. So for the first one, we'll do metallic. And we'll just kind of play around with the parameters here and get a feel for how this works. So we can go ahead and turn on all of these here. We won't need all of these for this first example. All right, so first we can change the color. I'll go ahead and set it to maybe a deep green. And metallic I can set to 0.5. And you'll notice it does start to darken and sort of give a more of a contrasted effect around the edges. And if I set it to 1, you can see it gets really dark and sort of highlights that effect. So I'll set it to maybe 0.9 or 0.8. And then roughness should increase it. So, if I lower roughness, you can see we start to get actually the reflections of things around us and in the sky. So this is probably some of the clouds. And if we increase roughness to 1, well, you'll notice that it looks pretty flat. So by lowering roughness, we get the nice reflections. And by increasing it, they sort of go away. So for metallic, I'll lower it to 0.2. And by playing around with the color, you can get an idea of kind of how this looks with different vibes. All right. And next we have the plastic. So for this one, I'll just set it to be not metallic at all. And for this case, I only have to turn on roughness. And I'll set this to 0.9. But you'll notice that not much changes. And that's because the metallic seems like it does need to be on just a bit. So I'll set that to 0.5. And now when I increase or lower the roughness, you get this nice effect. So I might do 0.25 for the metallic and then lower that. So we kind of get this nice, it's shiny, but it's not super metallic looking. Now, one thing that I want to point out, this goes back to the specular that I mentioned earlier. And you'll notice that we do get a specular highlight that is not cell shaded. And that is why we need to go back into our master material, scroll up to the specular output here, and you can either type in 0 here, or you can hold 1 and click for a scalar parameter, or sorry, just a constant scalar value, and then plug this into specular. And now that it's 0, I can go ahead and save, and this should disappear. And now we get the nice flat cell shading. So very important, you want your specular to be 0 so it doesn't override the reflections and things that you have going on there. All right, for the matte character, We can go into color real quick, maybe set it to be a deep blue, and then go up to roughness, set this to 1, but you'll notice that you still need to turn on metallic and increase it just a bit, so maybe 0.5. And then if we go back to the plastic one, we can adjust that one a bit. Let's say maybe we do 0.5 here and lower the roughness to maybe 0.25. Now it's not as deep looking as this one on the left, the actual metallic, and we could increase that contrast even more by going back to the metallic one and raising it to maybe 0.9. Now this one definitely looks more metallic in my opinion. And then we have this one that's not very metallic, but definitely shiny. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong one. Plastic. And then we have the sort of flat one that doesn't have that extra specular highlight or the band that comes with the reflections. So that's kind of how you can get the different base PBR values like that. You'll notice that, you do have to mess with this metallic value. We're sort of faking the PBR values, but this is one way to do it because getting true PBR values is quite difficult in cell shading. And this is just one workaround that you can use is sort of use the metallic parameter to sort of bypass the need for actually getting the PBR values. And it still looks quite nice. All right, next we can make a character material for Quinn here and actually use the textures that come along with the character and see how to use the exclusion mask. So what I'll do is make a new material instance from mCharacter, and I'll call this mi underscore character underscore Quinn. And I'll go ahead and open this up. All right, once we have this opened up, we can turn on all the parameters that we'll be messing with. And once we have those, we can browse to our character's textures. So I'm using Quinn, so I'll just browse to the material that's on her by default, and then go back a level to mannequins, and then go to textures. Again, you might be using your own textures here, but for the tutorial, I'll just be using Quinn. And now we can start plugging in some textures. So the albedo will be the Quinn 02 ID underscore D. And as you can see, we get the albedo texture. And what I can do right away is just throw this on Quinn. You'll notice that the face is messed up, and that's because Quinn has 2 material slots, and I'll show how to fix that once I get the rest of these textures plugged in. From here, we can put in the emissive mask, and I'll be using the CC plastic for that, because I know that there's a nice texture in here that we can use on one of the channels. For the exclusion mask, I'll be using the MSR, and the normal will be the underscore BN texture here. And now you can see on the chest plate here, we get the nice normal map information as well as the color. So now what we can do is make the face material. So what I'll do is go browse to my Quinn. And what I like to do is right click and make a new material instance from this material instance. So it's sort of a hierarchy of 3. I'll call this underscore face. So it's the same naming, but underscore face at the end. And if I double click to open this up, you can see all these are turned off, and the parent is the mi character Quinn that we were just messing with. So for example, if I change the color on this one, it should update to be the same on the secondary. Well, it shows it here, but it looks like it's glitched out. It'll update in a moment, I'm sure. But now that I have the underscore face, we can drag this on the face. And all we want to change in here is the textures. Everything else will stay the same and be controlled from the other material instance. So here we can now browse back to the textures, and we want to use the other set of textures. So I'll use the underscore 01 textures instead. Drag these all in here like so. And the normal map. And now you can see that the head looks correct, and it has the right texture set in the normal maps, and as well as the legs. So now we can go back to Quinn, and I can close out of the face one now. Now if I go ahead and, for example, turn up the metallic it'll only affect one part of the character. And that's because in the exclusion mask that we selected, we are by default using the um, exclusion channel red. So that means inside the texture that we put in the exclusion mask, we're using the red channel. So if I deselect G and B and only have R selected, you can see that this is a nice black and white texture that we can use to differentiate two different parts of the character. And we can visualize that here by, for example, we increase the metallic, or we change the color, and it only affects that part of the mesh, which is important. That's what we want to do. And now we can mess around a little bit more with some of these parameters. So I'll set the roughness to be maybe 0.75. I'll leave metallic around 1, but we'll do 0.9, not fully 1. And then roughness B, that's going to be the main part of the body. I'll set to 0.2. And metallic B, we do need to increase to maybe 0.9. And now we can mess around with the roughness some more. I'll do 0.15. Now you can see we get the reflections of the environment. We kind of see the clouds here, and it looks pretty nice. It looks like a reflective cell shaded look. I might increase it just a bit, maybe 0.2. Yeah, we'll do 0.2. And metallic B might be a little high. I'll do 0.8. And now when I change color B, it should affect the entire body except for the sort of crevice area that's being controlled by the exclusion mask. Now we can also mess around with the anisotropy. So if I want to affect the anisotropy on the main part of the body, looks like I'll have to use the B. And as you can see, it sort of stretches the reflections, which gives it a more interesting look than just being metallic and shiny. But you'll notice that the seam here is from the texturing of the character. So it just kind of depends if you want to deal with that or not. But your character probably won't have this issue if it was modeled in, a different way. So yeah, just some parameters that you can mess around with to create different looks. And it all works with the cell shading, so that's pretty cool in my opinion. The next thing we need to do is visit the emissive channel. So our emissive mask I put in is this texture here. Again, you might have your own textures, and your texture channel that you use might be in a different channel. But if I unselect R and G, you can see in the B channel, we get this nice, mostly black texture, but with some white accents. And this looks like a great texture to use for emissive accents. So what we want to do, since we know it's on the B channel, again, yours might be on the G, yours might be on the R, or even the alpha. But in this case, we're going to use the B. And then I want to go to emissive channel, and from the drop down, I want to select blue. You never want to mess with this parameter here. I don't know why this is included when you make a parameter. I wish they would take that out. But just leave this alone and only use the drop down. So now that I have blue selected here, I want to find my emissive tint. So if I go to emissive tint, by default it's black, which will be off. But as soon as I start dragging around the color, you can see we get the emissive color there. Maybe set it to a nice lime green. One thing to keep in mind with this cell shading method is that if you go to change the emissive tint to a value above 1, like for example, if you set the value to 1000, it kind of just makes it look weird, and it doesn't actually become brighter like you would expect. You would kind of expect a bloom effect where it glows around the character, but unfortunately it's going to clamp it at 1, and anything above this will just make the edges look jagged. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But one thing you can do, for example, if you do have some emissive particles that you need to look brighter, or maybe a fire, or anything that you can just apply an emissive material to, you can just create a material, call it M emissive. And the workaround I found is to set the blend mode from opaque to translucent, and then shading model from default lit to unlit. And then if you make a color parameter, we'll call this color, and then we'll multiply this by a scalar. We'll call this emissive intensity. Default value can be 1. Oops. Plug that into emissive. Set it to be blue. and save. From here, we can make a material instance. I'll just leave the name as is. And if we go ahead and duplicate this, this cube here, I can put um, the master there, and then I'll put the instance here. So if I open the instance and change the emissive intensity, you can see we do get that glowing effect that you would expect. But if I, set it back to the opaque method um, and default lit, you can see no matter what value I set this at, it doesn't go above 1 as it is in the preview here. We do want this effect. So, for props and things like that, you can use this method where you set the blend mode to translucent and shading model to unlit. And just for this example, I'll set this back to the default how I had it. And yeah, now you have full emissive control over things that might need an emissive material. Now, technically you could put this on your characters, but it wouldn't work because we set the shading model to unlit. So this was really great for things like particles and things that you need in your game that need to work with the cell shading. If you want them to have bloom and be brighter, then you can use this method. All right, lastly, we can go back to our materials and our post-process instance and kind of look at some of the parameters here. So, for example, we have this AO intensity parameter. If I go over here in the dark and set this value to 0, you can see that it totally removes that sort of nice self-shadowing effect. Now, if you are doing a totally stylized cel-shaded game and you don't want any gradients anywhere, I do recommend turning your AO intensity from 1 to 0, but sometimes you do want a little bit of nice gradient, so you could set it to maybe 0.5 or 1. I think you can go above as well, and it gets really dark, which looks kind of bad, so I do recommend staying at 1 or below. And then, of course, the bands are going to control where the shadows start and stop, and you can mess around with these, or you can go into your material. And if you want less bands, of course, you can go ahead and remove some of this. For example, you could remove this band here for light C or the B, and then just, plug in the respective ones so it continues that chain. And then you would, for example, only have a few bands. But for this purpose, I do like having the 4 different bands. And we can go back to this one, this again, and we can check out what else we have. Yes, the light A is going to control your darkest band, and B, and so forth. Just gets brighter and brighter as you go out. And shadow contrast, this is a good one. So I have it at 500 by default, but if you lower this, you can get a little bit nicer of a softer band effect. So value of 1, of course, is going to pretty much get you back to the default shading. 10, 20, 50, 100. I like 500, it's nice and sharp. And now you can also look at the tinting effect. So you can tint the highlights of your cell shading. If you're going for more of a stylized look, you might have a art direction and a color theme that you want to go for. And you can tint the highlights and the shadows differently. So here you can see I have the highlight tinted a warmer color and the shadow tinted a cooler color, which gives it a kind of a nice stylized look. And you can also use this to straight up darken your shadows as well if you don't want to mess with the skylight in your scene. So I like it at the default, so I'll leave it as is. All right, and now as a bonus, I'll show how to set up a outline material to use with the post-process cell shading. We can go into our materials folder here, and I'll just right click and make a material here. You can get more organized if you'd like, and then I'll name this M_outline. Double click to open this up. And the first thing we want to do is change blend mode from opaque to masked and shading model from default lit to unlit. And we want to check two-sided to be true. The first thing we need to do is hold 3 and click to get a black color, and this will go straight into emissive color. Next, we need to right click, search for two-sided sign, and drag off of here to get a 1- node to flip it. And then we can multiply this by a Fresnel. So I want to right click and search for Fresnel. And then we can copy this 1- node down here. And this will go into the multiply. And then from here, we drag this into opacity mask. And then to be able to control the size of the outline, we need to right click and search for vertex normal world space. And then we want to drag off here and search for multiply again. And then we need a scalar parameter. So I'll hold S and click, and I'll call this outline width. And then by default, I'll set it to maybe 0.75, and I'll plug this into world position offset. So it's going to look pretty weird in the default, but if you have a little hole at the bottom, that's a good sign. And now we can go ahead and save, minimize this. I'll make an instance of this. I'll call it mi underscore outline. And what I'll do to make sure it applies to all of them is I'll control click all 4 of these mannequins and then search in the details panel for overlay. And then we can just drag mi outline straight into here. And as you can see, now we have the outline. And if I open up the instance, we have this parameter to control how thin it is. So for some art styles, it's really nice to have a thin outline. I know that's pretty popular with some people. And then also you can make it as thick as you want. It's one thing to keep in mind. If you make it too thick, though, you'll start to get some visual glitches. Like if the mesh overlaps with itself here, you can see that the finger is too close to the leg, so it's going in a bit. So I really don't recommend anything over 1, to be honest. I like 0.75 as the default. And yeah, that's how to set up the outline. And if you want to set it up on your character, you would go into your character. Or sorry, for mine it's in third person, blueprints, BP third person character. And then we can go to the mesh and then search for overlay here. And then here's where we would put the outline. So mi outline. And while we're here, we can actually visualize the materials. So if I do character underscore Quinn, I can find the 2 materials. See if that looks right. Oh, looks like I got them flipped. So this one should be the face, and then this one should be the regular. Oh, whoops. Still don't have it right. There we go. Now if I compile that, minimize, we'll go full screen and play. Cool. Looks like now we have our cell shaded Quinn with an outline in all of its glory. The last thing that we can do really quick is to test the lighting with the colored point lights on the cell shading. So if you click this little box here, go to lights, point light, drag it out, clear that search there, and we'll set the color to be maybe a really lime green. And I'll just copy over one of these here, drag it in front of the light. As you can see, the light does color the character as you would expect. Usually post-processed materials, it's hard to get the lighting from your scene and colored lights specifically to affect your mesh. Now, it's one thing to keep in mind is on your material, if you set your color to be too dramatically saturated, it will sort of fight the color of the light. So as you can see here, if I set it to be this really vibrant pink, it's having a hard time picking up the green. But as soon as I lower the saturation, you can see it starts to affect it. And to be honest, you shouldn't have your colors fully saturated anyway, because in the real world, nothing is really fully saturated or fully bright. So you kind of want to keep your values a little bit up off of the bottom and the top of these bars here, just to keep it a little bit more natural looking. All right, that's how to create an advanced cell shading post-process material inside Unreal Engine 5, complete with support for metallic surfaces, reflections, colored lights, ambient occlusion, and even an outline material. If you guys learned absolutely anything at all, it would mean a great deal to us if you left a like on the video and subscribe to our channel. And also check out our new game Skyblocker on Steam, as it's the #1 way to support us in what we do here to help us keep bringing tutorials like this one to you. This has been Vylocity with Pitchfork Academy, and I'll see you in the next one.